Let's go ahead and talk with Colonel Jeff Addicott. Professor Addicott, of course, heads the St. Mary University School of Law Center for Terrorism Law. Good morning, Colonel. Thanks for joining us here today.
Good morning, Doug.
Let's go ahead and talk about this bail situation. I was wondering if you could take our listeners through not only what is alleged to have happened, but also what will happen from a legal standpoint, and then, of course, you want to get your comment on some of the, I guess, situations surrounding this, because this is, I don't believe anything I read in the liberal, ultra-liberal media anyway, and this sounds to be a very complex situation. This doesn't appear to be a cut and dry shut case. So why don't you go ahead and I won't ask too many questions. That's our agenda. If you could lay it out what is alleged to have happened, and then especially the military aspect of these charges, because that judicial system that you are so well familiar with is unknown to most of us, and then, the situational circumstances.
Well, yeah, Staff Sergeant Bales, United States Army, we know we had several tours and combat tours, and one of the things we have in Afghanistan these days, we have a lot of cameras set up around our bases to watch things. So there's actually film of Sergeant Bales that has not been released, but you can expect that will be released. That'll be a pretty good indicator of what he's doing. Was he on a combat mission? Was he going out by himself? Was he ordered to go out in this particular area? And those are all questions we've got to answer. We've had civilian casualties associated with combat in the past. Obviously, in every combat, that's part of the law of war. You don't intentionally mean to kill civilians, but if there's a firefight or exchange of gunfire and civilians are in the way, then that certainly has happened in the past. I don't have all the facts in this case. It seems like a very large number of civilians, 17, that died. And so the initial investigation found that this was not a combat-directed activity, that he had gone out there on his own and engaged in this activity. That said, of course, across the backdrop of what's happening in Afghanistan these days, it's a very touchy situation, because let's assume that he did commit murder. This is not uncommon. We have soldiers that commit murder either during war or during peacetime. That's where we have JAG officers, military police. We have a judicial system that deals with them. But the Afghan people, as we saw with the burning of the Quran, simply go into rages over things that most of us would say, well, some pages were burned. Does it deserve to have 7 Americans killed as a response? And the answer, of course, is no. But they really have no frame of reference for what democratic behavior is all about, because they're captured by a religious ideology that is extremely legalistic and coupled with fanaticism and emotionalism. It's a deadly witch's brew. And so Staff Sergeant Bales right now is in pretrial confinement in Kansas, and his charges have been read to him. But the defense counsel, of course, is going to look at, and he's hired a civilian lawyer. He also has a military lawyer appointed to him. One of the issues that's going to be very troubling for the government is we've had already some disturbing signs from Leon Panetta, who is the Secretary of Defense. He got on TV and said this case deserves the death penalty. Well, in the military, we have a doctrine called unlawful command influence, and that is if somebody in the chain of command directs somebody below them on how to proceed in a case, then the remedy in extreme cases can be that all the charges against the accused are dismissed. So when Panetta made that statement, he's basically signaling to the general that's going to be looking at this case, I want you to refer this case as a death penalty case, because that's an option that the general will have when the committing authority, the general that refers the charges, he has to make that decision. But we've already had a case of command influence by Panetta, opening his big mouth and make comments on the case. And of course he did that for political purposes, to soothe the hurt feelings, I guess, of the Afghan people. And I've seen more outcry and more crocodile tears from this administration about the Afghan people. I've seen nothing about the 50 or 60 Americans that have been murdered by Afghans since 2007, the hundreds that have been wounded, and of course the 7 that have been slaughtered. We see no film about their families, the impact on them back here in the United States when they're brought back in a coffin, and yet we see gigantic crocodile tears about the poor Afghan people. It's it's just outrageous how our administration has this selective outrage.
Well, and I, of course, totally agree. What about some of the? Well, that of course is somewhat troubling. If that can be, that could obviously. Well, I shouldn't say obviously. Under the military system, with this prejudicial chain of command comment, could that be basis of a motion of dismissal? Tell us how the military trials work. Will this be in front of a military tribunal?
It'll be in front of a military jury, which we call a panel in the military, but it's composed of officers. Since he's a staff sergeant, he can elect to have 1/3 of those members on the jury be enlisted personnel. But the next step is you're going to have an Article 32 officer appointed, and that's a fancy name for a grand jury investigation. So the charges have already been read to the accused. Now, and usually it's a full colonel, and the government will present all their evidence. The defense will present their evidence, and then that officer will make a determination to recommend to the general officer convening the case whether the case should go forward to trial or whether the case should be dismissed. And if it should go forward to trial, he can make a recommendation that it should be a death penalty case or just a life in prison type case. And that process could take a very long time. As we've seen in the Hassan case here in Texas, his trial's still going. That's 3 years. So this Article 32 session is going to last a long time. The defense counsel, of course, they're going to be attacking on procedural basis because you've got to bring in witnesses from Afghanistan, and you've got to prove the case. I think the defense counsel has quoted I think he got on TV and said, prove it.
Right.
You make all these allegations you want, but you got to bring live witnesses for Afghanistan. It's going to be a very difficult case to prove, very expensive case to prove. And I think the defense is kind of, they're kind of saying, well, if Obama pulls our troops out the next year and a half, you'll never even get these witnesses into the United States to testify. They'll be gobbled up by the Taliban or somebody else, or something will happen to them because you've got to prove the case.
Well, of course you do. I'm glad to hear that. I've always heard the military system is a little different from our regular American jurisprudence system, but that's encouraging that at least you do have to still prove the case into the military system. So a motion to dismiss or something like that isn't really probably a likelihood, even if the chain of command type foible here.
Yeah, that's right, Doug. I'm sorry. Yeah, they will make a motion to dismiss. It'll probably be denied, but what they're hoping for is on appeal. Is once the case is finished, then you can appeal all the mistakes that you see that proceeded during the case. And I had a case that I worked on years ago where I convicted this fellow of very serious crimes, and on appeal, all the charges were dismissed because a battalion commander, unbeknownst to me, had told his soldiers, do not cooperate with the defense counsel as extenuation and mitigation witnesses. And just that statement alone, all charges against this senior enlisted personnel were dismissed, and he got full back pay and reinstated the whole 9 yards. So that's that's something the defense counsel is going to try to do, and the government is going to have to cross every T, dot every I, because this is a high-profile case, and everyone's going to be watching the outcome. So it's going to be a very long process. But the military rules of evidence are exactly the same, word for word, as the federal rules of evidence that you would have in a federal court. So all the rights that any common criminal gets is going to be afforded to a military soldier accused of crimes.
And we're talking to Professor Jeff Addicott of St. Mary's University Center for Terrorism Law about the situation regarding Army Staff Sergeant Robert Bales and the charges that have been filed against him. Now, he will be held until trial. I mean, this could take years and years.
Yeah, he'll be held in what's called pretrial confinement. And in cases where you have, murders or lots of murders involved, that's pretty standard practice. And he'll be held in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The government has to show that he's a threat to others or a flight risk. And he'll be held. Now, if he's convicted, the time that he's held in pretrial confinement will be credited to his sentencing portion.
Right. Now, how problematic, Colonel, is the possibility, we hear news reports now that the Afghani families were paid relatively large sums of money. The reports I'm seeing out of Fox News is that the families of those killed were paid $50,000, and those that were wounded $11,000 United States dollars. Over there, that's like that's like an unbelievable amount of money. Is that going to